Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in a few minutes. If you have questions as we go along, you can enter them in the Q&A. The chat has been disabled. We're still getting some participants in, so we will get started in just about a minute. Thank you for joining us today. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the third part of our webinar series on vegetable gardening. My name is Kathy Oliver, and I'm a program assistant here at Manatee County Extension Service in Palmetto. And I do help oversee a lot of the activities of the Master Gardeners. And every county in Florida does have an extension office, and many of the Master Gardeners run plant clinics to help customers. They answer questions about gardening, horticulture, pests, diseases, wildlife at the plant clinics, either by phone, by email, or in person. So I hope you will make use of your extension office in whatever county you're in. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days if you want to review it. And you can find past recordings of other webinars there at the YouTube channel also. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A. The chat has been disabled, and also your video and audio as well. So let's get started. We are covering today scouting for pests and diseases. So some of the topics we'll be looking at today include integrated pest management, or IPM, and we'll learn some simple scouting techniques that you can use in your garden and landscape. We'll be covering some different insects and diseases to help you with identification. We'll talk about using pesticides safely and biorational pesticides, and also give you some resources for some help. So what is IPM? It is Integrated Pest Management. So that means that it's a technique of pest management that uses many tools. And chemical options are really your last resort in integrated pest management. And pesticides are some of the most expensive inputs you can put into your garden. So using other methods before using chemicals is sustainable. It's more affordable because pesticides are high dollar, and it's also responsible. It does protect the health of the environment and your own health as well. So what are some of the tools that we use in IPM? One of the first ones, cultural practices, is something that you will look at even before you start your garden. So you want to look at plant varieties, perhaps, that are resistant to diseases that are common in your area, or resistant to nematodes. You want to plant your crops at the right time of the year, according to the seasons. And remember, right plant, right place. Locate your garden in an area where it's going to get a proper amount of sun, and use proper spacing on your plants so that they get good air circulation. And water and fertilize properly. That's very important. That keeps your plant healthy. A stressed plant really sends out alarm signals to pests to attract them. So the healthier your plants, the fewer pests you're going to have. There's also mechanical means of controlling pests. That would be things like hand picking. Some of the larger insects, you may be able to just pick them off the plant and drop them in soapy water. For smaller pests, you might be able to prune off some of the infected parts, or pick off diseased leaves so that they don't spread spores to other parts of the plant. And you can clean out weeds, dead leaves, anything that might harbor diseases or pests. There's also some biological controls that you can take advantage of. It doesn't really pay to release biological controls, or these are the natural enemies of some of our pests. So these are going to be other insects that are preying on pests. And utilizing those can be very effective, but not necessarily releasing them. You will be better off trying to attract beneficial insects to your garden. So we are going to talk about that a bit in this program. And remember, chemicals, even biorational pesticides, really should be used as the last resort when some of these other methods have failed to produce results. Some of the steps for implementing integrated pest management in the garden include scouting. That's regular inspection of your plants and looking at them up close and looking at all parts of the plant. Identification of what you find. If you find an insect, you do need to know, is it one that's causing a problem to your plants, or is it a beneficial insect that's really helping you with pest management? These the scouting, the identification will help you with your decision making, and you can decide if it's a type of damage that you can live with, or if your plant is still producing despite an infestation. You can make decisions about whether to treat or not. And it will help you decide what type of intervention you might need to control the problem. And of course, you always want to follow up on your treatments and see, was it successful? Do I need to retreat? So evaluation is an important part of the process. So when you're out scouting or inspecting your plants, obviously the picture here, this is a professional scout out in the tomato fields. But it does help you if you carry a little bit of equipment with you when you're out there looking at your plants. And one thing is a magnifier, a magnifying glass, a hand lens, because a lot of the pests are very tiny and you can't identify them just by looking with your naked eye. You really do need a magnifier to be able to see what exactly it is. You want to look at all parts of the plant and especially the undersides of leaves. A lot of insects are very good at hiding and camouflaging themselves, and that's another reason why it's good to have a hand lens. It also helps to know the normal look of the plant. You know what it's supposed to look like normally, so you're going to be inspecting your plants for abnormalities and taking a closer look at them. For example, take a look at this fern in the photo. You look at that, you see a lot of brown bumps on it. You think, oh, there's a bunch of insects infesting my plant, or it's got a disease. Well, actually, that is the normal look of a fern. It's just producing spores on the underside of its leaves, and so that's a natural occurrence. So knowing the normal look from the abnormal look is a plus. Another piece of equipment you might carry with you when you're out scouting is a whiteboard. This could be like a light white poster board, a clipboard with a white piece of paper. And you can use this to shake the leaves over the board, kind of tap them on the board. And any insects that are there, especially the real small ones, will fall off. And you can look at them a lot easier on this whiteboard. They really show up against the white paper. So that's a little trick you can use to help you if you don't want to crawl in amongst the leaves of your plants to look for insects. And once you've found something, you definitely want to try to identify it. What kind of insect is it? What kind of disease? Because this is going to help you with your treatment plan or help you decide what type of intervention you want to take. And it really helps to keep records. From year to year, you can consult your records. You can see when certain insects or diseases are likely to appear or under what conditions they might appear. So especially with diseases, knowing that things are going to occur year after year, you can get into a preventative program for some of these diseases. It's hard to prevent insects, but diseases, yes, you can to some extent. So when you're out there scouting, what are you looking for? Well, remember any abnormalities like chewed leaves. Sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes it's not so obvious. So remember, look at all parts of the plants. Sometimes you'll actually find ragged leaves, holes in the leaves, or this skeletonizing effect, where just the epidermis of the leaf has been scraped off by some insect. Some other signs of insect feeding, other than chewing, is through insects that cause piercing and sucking damage. There are some insects, mostly small soft-bodied insects, that actually have a little stylet or proboscis that they poke into the leaf or the stem or the fruit and draw out the plant juices. So everywhere they've poked into the leaf, you see little dots or specks, such as with the stippling that you see with spider mites. a real spotted stippled effect. Insects like thrips will often rasp or scrape the surface of the leaf. So you can see that in the lower left picture. And then you might see cupping or deformed or crumpled looking leaves. And especially if they're at the newer growth, that's often an indication of aphids feeding. Aphids feed in such large numbers. Usually they're very prolific in their reproduction. They often are found in high populations on the plant, so they can cause a lot of damage, especially to the new tender growth. You can also look for signs of insect feeding, such as frass or insect poop. Frass is usually evident below wherever insects are feeding, like caterpillars, as you see on the left. Or sometimes you might see little black dots on the leaf that look like tar spots. And those are all types of insect frass. So when you see frass, you know there's an insect feeding on your plant. And along with insect feeding also and excrement comes some insects will secrete these plant juices that they're feeding on as a shiny sticky substance called honeydew. And you see that in the top left picture. It is something that coats the leaves, and often it promotes the growth of a black mold called sooty mold. And so whenever you see this black sooty mold, you know that you have an insect problem. So you want to look at the vegetation above where you see the honeydew or the sooty mold to find the insects that are creating that honeydew. And it is mostly the black sooty mold is kind of an aesthetic problem. It's not really harming the plant, but if it's so thick on the leaves, it can interfere with photosynthesis. So once you control the insect problem, the sooty mold usually disappears with time. So how do you take IPM into your garden? Just to review, get out there and scout, see what's abnormal, look closely at it. When you find something, try to get an identification on it. If there are some different resources, and I'll mention a few, but if you need help with identification of insects, please feel free to visit any extension office in your county, and they can help identify things. And if the master gardeners or someone like myself doesn't know the answer, we can always go to some of the experts at the University of Florida. Extension is associated with the University of Florida, and we have all those resources at our disposal to help us with identification. So you've ID'd the problem. This looks like aphids here on this tomato leaf, and a good control and safe control for aphids is insecticidal soap. So that is our intervention tactic. So let's talk a little bit about some of the insects you might find in the vegetable garden. You do want to get out there and scout, and you do want to take action if needed, because remember, there are certain pests that do transmit diseases, such as viruses, fungus, bacterial diseases. So that is something to consider when you're deciding whether you want to treat or not. But only 1% of all the insects in the world are pests. There are a lot of harmless insects out there, or actually helpful insects that help us by preying on pests. So you want to make sure to preserve the beneficial insects. Here's a great identification resource called Helpful, Harmful, Harmless. It's produced by the University of Florida, and it's available in the bookstore. And it's a little flip chart of all different types of commonly encountered insects and whether they're good for us or bad for us. So we're going to take a look at some chewing insects first. If you've ever grown any vegetables, you've probably encountered caterpillars, the larval stage of moths or butterflies. And you probably first noticed chewing holes in the leaves. The larvae are pretty destructive to some of the leaves. And often some of these pests are found in very, very large numbers. So that's why scouting is important, to catch these early. The tomato hornworm here on the left feeds on the leaves of tomatoes and related plants, and they can also feed on the fruits as well. And that's one that when you find it, that's a good candidate for hand picking because they're big and fairly easy to handle. And remember to look for frass. There's a lot of frass associated with caterpillar feeding. So if you see little droppings like this, frass, then you want to start looking for caterpillars feeding somewhere. A few other caterpillars in the large picture, those are armyworms. There's lots of different species of armyworms. Many of them are pests of vegetables. You can kind of recognize armyworm caterpillars by the ring of black dots at the rear of the thorax there. That's the middle part of the insect. And this upper left picture is a pickleworm damage. Pickleworms will burrow into the flowers and the fruits of squashes, cucumbers, different types of cucurbits. And this is all their frass being extruded from the hole where they burrowed in. It's a big disappointment to cut into one of your prized vegetables and find a pickleworm. Another common pest, especially on tomatoes and also citrus, is the leaf miner. And this is the larva of a fly or sometimes a moth or a beetle. The insect lays its eggs on the leaf surface, and the larva burrows under and tunnels through the leaf, eating away. And it stays, excuse me, it stays under the surface of the leaf. So it's kind of protected in there, and it's a little difficult to treat. So leaf miner, we usually tell people not to worry too much about. If the leaf is very heavily infested, you can pick a leaf off and get rid of it. Don't put it in your compost pile because you don't want that larva to hatch out. And a plant can withstand about 20% defoliation without a loss in production. So don't worry too much if you have to pick off leaves. And our next species up is beetles. Beetles are one of the largest groups of insects out there. Actually, it is the largest order of insects. And there's lots of different kinds. Some of them are good or beneficial, but a lot of beetles are pests. Here we have a cucumber beetle on the top right. And another striped one is the Colorado potato beetle. And down in the bottom right, you see the Mexican bean beetle. And you might be able to guess what a close relative of the beetle is, the lady beetle. It does look a lot like a lady beetle, but this one is not beneficial. This one is a pest. And you can see the larval form of the beetle as well as the pupa in that photo. Beetles can carry bacterial diseases, and even though leaf feeding is not as big a problem as some of the sap feeders, if they do occur in high numbers, and especially on young plants, it can hurt the plants. Sorry, I've got a tickle in my throat. Slugs and snails are another big problem, and they're one that you don't often run across because they're kind of in hiding during the day and they come out at night or in wet weather. You might see evidence of them around by their slime trails, which are shiny trails that they use to move along and leave behind, or you might find some of their frass left behind, which is usually coiled up. And a slug, the one down in the bottom picture, is just a shellless snail. Does the same kind of damage. There are baits you can put out for snails, and I recommend iron phosphate bait. It's an organic one. There are baits, snail baits with a product called metaldehyde, but that is a little bit dangerous because it's a poison, and some dogs or wildlife could be attracted to that. So use the iron phosphate. It's actually a fertilizer as well. And our next one is whiteflies. And these are very small insects. You will notice them sometimes. The adults will fly out when you brush up against a plant. And you'll see they look like little white moths, but they're actually related to aphids and mealybugs. And the nymphs cause damage as well as the adults. These are piercing sucking insects, so they are sucking the juices out of the leaves. And the nymphs are these little oval creatures that have no legs yet, but they are sucking on the plant juices. So this is the easiest stage to control. The nymphs are sedentary. If you can spray them with a soap or oil, you can get control of the whitefly problem. But nymphs can look different depending on what species it is. And if you notice this nymph on the very far right, it's got red eyes. That means it's about to, actually this is a pupa, further stage, just before the adult stage, and it's about to hatch out when you see those two red eyes. It is about to hatch out into the adult stage. Whiteflies really do need to be controlled because they do carry a variety of different viruses, and especially things like viruses on tomatoes and peppers. Another small piercing sucking insect are aphids. And as I mentioned, they do like the new growth, the young tender growth at the tips of the branches. And a good way to identify aphids is by their cornicles. And cornicles are these little tailpipe things here on the rear end of the aphid. Aphids generally are pear-shaped, body shape, and they can come in a lot of different colors. They can range from green to orange to yellow to black or purple. And there are winged forms of aphids that fly off to find new places to infest. But normally they're very sedentary on the undersides of the leaves or along the stems of the plant. And all the aphids are females. They are able to reproduce without the help of a male. Aphids are really common in leafy greens like Swiss chard, collards, kale, especially curly kale. They'll get up in some of the little curls of the plant and where you can't really notice them. So look closely. Use that hand lens. Another very small insect is thrips, and a single thrips is still called a thrips. It's thrips, whether it's singular or plural. And usually the immatures are kind of whitish or yellow, like the one shown here, along with some of the eggs there on the leaf. But the adults can range from yellow to black to some are banded with red bands. But they're all very small size, and you really do need a hand lens to see them. But again, here are some of the damage that thrips cause, kind of those scrape marks on the leaves. In severe infestations, you'll get scarring that's kind of reddish or brown. So that's another sign of thrips, is some of that dark scarring look on the leaves. You'll also find thrips in flowers. There's a lot of flower thrips. They do especially love the flowers of peppers. Here's another one that has both beneficial members as well as pests in this family or group of the stink bugs and the leaf-footed bugs. Here's the leaf-footed bug down here in the left bottom, and you can see where they get that name. They have those appendages that look kind of leaf-shaped. And they're, the nymphs of the leaf-footed bug are bright red. And in fact, many of the stink bugs have very colorful nymphs, as you see here. They've just hatched out of these eggs, which are barrel-shaped and usually laid in clusters. We have a green stink bug and a brown stink bug, both very damaging pests. And generally, kind of a general rule of thumb is that the pest stink bugs have rounded shoulders, whereas the beneficial stink bugs, which are predators, they will have spines or sharper shoulders. Stink bugs are difficult to control. Like beetles, they have a rather hard outer body, as opposed to some of the aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, which are soft bodies. These hard-bodied insects are harder to control with some of the more gentler pesticides, the biorational pesticides. So there are other tactics you can use to keep these off your plants, like exclusion. You could throw that lightweight row cover over it to keep the stink bugs out. And then if you need pollination when it starts flowering, you can remove this lightweight fabric to allow for pollination. Plus, the other thing about these guys is they fly. So they come and go. And it's hard to control populations of these strong flyers with insecticides. So Hand picking is something you can do if you're out there scouting regularly. Carry a jar of water, soapy water with you, and just knock these guys off into that. So our next ones are not insects. They're mites. Mites are actually tiny arachnids, relatives of spiders. And you definitely need a hand lens for these to see the actual insects, but you can see the damage that they cause, that stippling effect where they're feeding on the plant juices. If they're in very heavy infestations, you might see webbing, and you might think it's a spider. But if you see a lot of little creatures in there, those are probably mites. And our most common one is the two-spotted spider mite, which is shown here, has the two dark spots on the body. And they can really infest a plant in high numbers and cause a lot of damage. So it's important to keep on top of mites. And there are special insecticides called miticides. So if you need to use chemicals, if you haven't been able to control them by other means, sometimes you might want to look for a miticide rather than just a straight insecticide. Or read the label. It's always important to read the label to see what insects the product works on. And this picture here of the pepper is infested by broad mites. Broad mites are very common in peppers, and they're usually up in the very top, and their feeding causes the leaves to become very crumpled looking, deformed, very unhealthy looking. So if you see that type of damage, it's probably broad mites. And you won't see the mites themselves. They're even smaller than spider mites, and they're kind of whitish clear looking, so they're a little hard to spot. Usually you need to take them under the microscope to see them. Now we're going to talk about some different control methods. One method is biocontrol. Take advantage of some of the existing natural enemies of the pests by attracting them to your garden. So when we talk about beneficial insects or biocontrol, we're looking at insects that are predators on pests. This is things like lady beetles, lacewings, spiders even, ground beetles, wasps. And oftentimes wasps are parasitoids also. Parasitoids are a little different from parasites, and I'll explain that later. Some other biological controls include pathogens that can infect pest insects. For example, this caterpillar down at the bottom has been infested by a fungal disease. There are beneficial nematodes. I know you probably heard about nematodes and how damaging they can be, but there are what's called entomopathic nematodes, which can infest pest insects and kill them. It has to be under certain conditions, though, where they can reach the pests easily, because nematodes are normally microscopic soil-dwelling organisms. So let's take a look at some predators. Predators tend to be larger insects. Think praying mantid. Here's one of the beneficial stink bugs. And by the way, the reason why they're called stink bugs is because if you mess with them or squish them, they do give off a rather foul odor. But here's a stink bug, and you can see the spines on the shoulder and also the prey he's got. He's captured prey and sucking the juices out of it. So that's a good stink bug, or soldier bug. A lot of the beneficials are called soldier bugs. Predators can kill a lot of prey. They tend to be generalists rather than specialists, so they'll eat a range of different prey items. And as a general rule, they tend to be bigger than their prey, of course, like most predators. They're fiercer. They'll usually eat whatever they can get their hands on. They're usually not found in as large a numbers. So if you see a big cluster of insects on a leaf, it's likely that they are pests rather than beneficials. And predators do, of course, tend to run around a little bit faster than their prey. And a good example of this is mites. There are predatory mites that feed on other mites. So you will often see them running around quickly searching for food, whereas the pest mites are generally much more sedentary or staying in place and feeding. So predators are just much more active. Here's some examples of some predators. Most of you are probably familiar with the lady beetle, which is the top left photo. Come in a range of colors. They can be solid black. They can have just couple of black spots, couple of red spots. But both the adult and the larva are very efficient predators on aphids. And this is the larva of the lady beetle. So they look quite a bit different. That's one thing that makes insect identification challenging, is that there's so many different life stages with a lot of these insects. And often the larval form looks very different from the adult form. Another predator following around kind of clockwise, we have a minute pirate bug, and they are great for preying on thrips. So they get up into the flowers and the little cracks and crevices of the plant and find those pest insects to feed on. This one below that is called an assassin bug. And he's got some bright colors, orange and black, and oftentimes that is a warning for others to stay away. And these guys do have a little bit of a painful sting if they bite you. So you want to be careful about handling the assassin bug. Just kind of leave it alone and let it do its work. In the middle, and you see eggs on a stalk. And that's the eggs of the green lacewing. And the larva is just below that, and that one has an aphid clutched in its jaws. These are often called aphid lions. But green lacewings and related species, the brown lacewing, they are very efficient general predators. So they'll eat a wide range of prey items, from aphids to whiteflies to scales, mealybugs. So they're a good general predator. And then we have a mealybug destroyer in the bottom left. And the big kind of fuzzy white thing is the larval form of the mealybug destroyer, which is a type of lady beetle. And there you see it feeding on all the little pinkish looking mealybugs. And both the adult and the larva feed on mealybugs. Here's a closer look at the green lacewings. And the adult form is a nectar feeder. So it's the larva that is the predator. And being general predators, they are cannibalistic. So that's why the eggs are kind of placed up on a stalk to keep them separated from each other. So when they hatch out, they're less likely to eat each other. And this sort of life cycle kind of tells you why it's good to plant nectar bearing flowers in your garden, because a lot of the adult forms of these beneficial insects are nectar feeders. Here's a one that you may not have heard about. It's called a Syrphid fly, or hover fly, or flower fly. And again, the adult is a nectar feeder. And you may mistake it for a wasp because it's got yellow and dark black or bluish stripes. There's a few different types of syrphid flies. And the larva kind of looks like a caterpillar, so you might mistake it for a pest. But you notice it's kind of translucent on the edges. You can kind of see dark in the middle. So watch out for these guys because they are beneficial. What's the difference between a parasite and a parasitoid? Well, the parasitoids, which are mostly beneficial to us by preying on pest insects, they are very host specific and they always kill their prey. So parasites are a little bit different. Sometimes they can live within their host and never kill it. And often they're not host specific. They can infest a variety of hosts. Parasitoids tend to be very specialized. The adults lay their eggs on a host and the larvae hatch out and feed on that host. They're often very, very tiny. You never know they're around until you see evidence that they are parasitizing some of your pest insects. As you can see here on the right, those are pupal cases of a wasp. So on a caterpillar, the caterpillar looks like it's in the end stages, but it's kind of interesting how different wasps will lay their eggs on the caterpillar. The larva will hatch out and burrow into the caterpillar, but they manage to avoid eating any of the vital organs. So the caterpillar actually stays alive during the feeding by the larva. And then when you see these pupal cases on the outside, the caterpillar's really been finished off and the adults are about to hatch, the adult wasps are about to hatch out from those pupal cases. Over on the left, you can see scale, which is another insect that doesn't look like an insect because it's kind of plastered to the stem or the leaf of the plant. And the organism is protected underneath a hard or a soft shell there. But they can be parasitized, and you will know if your scale has been parasitized if you see this nice, neat, round hole. And that's where the adult wasp has cut a nice, neat exit hole in order to emerge from that scale insect that it has eaten up. And the scale will be dry and not juicy at all. It'll just be dry and flaky when you press on it. It's kind of like a mummy. A live scale will be quite juicy when you poke at it. So here's some parasitoids in action. These are both wasps. One is laying eggs on an aphid on the bottom there, and one on a caterpillar. And there's the pupal cases again emerging from the caterpillar that's a goner. And here's the aphid mummies, the parasitized aphids, and you can tell that that's an aphid that has been completely consumed and is dry. It's just a shell really, and there's the nice neat exit hole of the parasitoid. How do you attract beneficials to your garden? Well, it's important to think about how much damage you can live with. You know, allowing a little bit of damage and a low level of pests will help keep beneficials around your garden. If you completely eradicate everything, that's their food supply is gone and the beneficials will take off. But if you can live with a little bit of damage and a low pest population, then you will generally have beneficials working throughout your garden. And also, if you have a diversity of plantings, you can attract different types of beneficials. And think about plants that are going to provide nectar, or there are certain plants that have specialized structures like hollow thorns, which are good hiding and sheltering places for beneficials. You can also think about using banker plants. What are banker plants? Well, banker plants are interesting in that they are plants that host a pest that only gets on that host, and the pest does not go out into and infest other plants in your garden. So it's specific to one host. Like there's aphids that they're called oleander aphids. They're orange aphids that are found almost exclusively on milkweed plants. And so you can bring a milkweed plant in your garden that has these aphids on it and not worry about those aphids traveling to other plants in your garden. But those aphids on the milkweed are going to attract a lot of beneficial insects that are going to feed not only on the milkweed or oleander aphids, but also on all the aphids in your garden, because most predators or parasitoids are specific to certain species of pest. Or certain types of pests, but they will feed on all different pests throughout the garden. Say aphids, if you have aphids in your garden, well, bring in the milkweed with the oleander aphids, and the predators will feed on all of the aphids. Nectar plants of specific shapes and forms will attract more beneficials. These beneficials, like the tiny little parasitic wasps, flies, they tend to like smaller flowers that are in clusters because it makes for much more efficient harvesting of the nectar in the flowers. They don't have to spend a lot of energy moving between flowers. So small flowers in clusters are great. Shallow flowers that have a nice little landing platform for the insect, and exposed nectaries where they can easily harvest the nectar are great attractors for beneficials. So you can see these kind of umbel type flowers that you find in dill and fennel, parsley, coriander. Those are very attractive to beneficials. So mixing some of these herbs into your garden as companion plants can only benefit you. Daisies and aster type flowers are another great one, because all these little flowers here in the middle have nectar for pollinators and beneficial insects. Just a word about nematodes. Florida soils are really, nematodes are found everywhere in our soils. So it's probably something you're going to have to deal with at some time in your gardening life. And it is important to know nematodes are not really visible to the naked eye, but you can see signs that they're around, especially with things like root knot nematode, which is this real lumpy looking form here on the root. those are fairly easy to see, but most nematodes are microscopic. You might see some damage on the roots from, or stubby looking roots from another species of nematode called stubby root nematode. There's many different species of nematodes, but there's, you might think if you see some round nodules on the roots, you're looking at nematodes, but there's another organism that's very beneficial on legumes called rhizomatous bacteria, and they attach themselves to the roots and they bring in nitrogen and transform it into a form that plants can use. So these bacterial nodules are very beneficial and nothing to worry about. So how do we manage nematodes? Well, there's no really chemical controls, so it's all sort of cultural things, planting resistant varieties, building raised beds, and putting in good soil rather than using field soil that may be infested with nematodes. Using crop rotation can help break the cycle, and this is also true of insect and diseases. So rather than planting crops in the same family in the same place year after year, you rotate with a different family. And so you kind of break that cycle. And you will see on a lot of seed packets and descriptions of vegetable varieties, it will say if they're nematode resistant. There's also companion plants. Marigolds are nematode repellents for certain species of nematodes. So you can companion plant with marigolds to help. And also adding any kind of organic matter to your soil is a good management strategy for nematodes, because that provides a healthier environment for your plants and the roots. It attracts beneficial insects that may prey on the nematodes, and it just serves to keep your plants healthy when you have a good organic soil that they're growing in. There's another management technique called solarization. And solarization is something that you can employ in any size garden, really, as long as you have a piece of clear plastic that's big enough to cover the soil. And this process takes advantage of free solar light. It's kind of like the greenhouse effect. The light penetrates through the clear plastic and it can't get back out. It's trapped by the plastic, so it heats the soil. And it will provide some control to about 4 to 6 inches down. It will kill off nematodes, weed seeds, some diseases, as long as you can get the temperature above 130 degrees for a week or two. And so you would do this in the hottest part of the year, usually summertime when our vegetable gardens are fallow. That's when you would do soil solarization. And you rake the soil smooth. If you're going to make any amendments to your soil, you would add them before the solarization process. Moisten the soil and lay down your plastic, and you want to get it sealed completely on the edges. You don't want to have any place for the heat to escape. No holes in the plastic, no rips or tears. That's very important. That's why you want to rake it nice and smooth, so nothing pokes through the plastic and lets the heat out. So our last option in intervention is chemical control. So when your other methods haven't worked, it is sometimes necessary to resort to pesticides. And it's a good idea to start with some of the least toxic pesticides first. This would be things, and biorational pesticides generally, they will target specific things like soft-bodied insects, and they have generally a low residual time in the environment, so they break down very quickly, and they have low toxicity to mammals. And so we don't have to worry about them too much as far as our health. So insecticidal soaps are really good for things like aphids, in some cases mealybugs. Mealybugs have a real waxy coating, as well as some whiteflies, and the soap really helps kind of break through that. And before you treat with some of these pesticides, it's kind of a good idea to give your plant a little bit of a spray with water. That kind of helps break up any webs or waxy coatings, and that allows the pesticide to penetrate a little better to the insect. Because most of these are contact pesticides, so you have to get good coverage and good contact on the insect itself. Horticultural oils help to smother insects, and you do want to use caution with oils, and neem is also usually in an oil base. That's a botanical from the neem tree. These things, any oil-based products, you want to be careful not to use them in the real hot part of the day, because they can have some phytotoxic effects on the plant. So they could hurt the leaves a bit if it's too hot when you spray these. BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis, is actually a microbial product that works only on caterpillars. So it works in their gut when they ingest it. So you spray it where the caterpillars are feeding, they ingest it, and it kind of makes their gut explode. So they stop feeding very quickly after ingestion of this. And it only works on caterpillars and not other insects. Another microbial product would be something like spinosad. There's also some pathogens. Bavaria is one that is a pathogen that infects insects, but it doesn't hurt humans. Whenever you're using insecticides, and follow some important safety measures, even with biorational pesticides or organic products, you never know how you might react to them, or, you know, along with sun exposure, sometimes you can have different reactions. So it is good to wear long sleeves, long pants, gloves whenever you're applying pesticides. Be sure to read and follow the label, use the rates that are on the label, pay attention to any precautions that are there. And to protect pollinators, you might want to think about spraying late in the day when pollinators are less active. And also, only spray insecticides where you have a problem. Just spot treat. Don't just spray everything hoping you'll somehow magically get an insect along the way. You just want to spray where you know there's a problem, so that's where scouting comes in handy. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about diseases, but there's a lot of things that can be mistaken for diseases that are actually disorders that are caused by something outside the plant that is not biological. So an environmental condition, or a lack of nutrients, or too much nutrient, over-fertilization. Those are disorders. Disease is caused by a pathogen like bacteria, virus, fungus, and they can infect all parts of the plant. So here I've illustrated a few disorders, and the top right And the bottom left, believe it or not, the bottom left looks like a disease, doesn't it? But that is actually magnesium deficiency in tomatoes, causing that spotting. The top right is pretty obvious that that's a nutritional deficiency. That is very typical chlorotic look, where the veins are still green and between the veins is yellow. That looks to me like an iron deficiency. Down below that, that damage there is caused by herbicide. And typical of herbicide damage, you get very strap-like growth on the leaves and a lot of deformed leaves and some necrosis or death occurring on the leaf. To the left of that, we have peppers that have something going on, and those have actually been scalded by the sun. All of a sudden, maybe a branch broke off and those peppers were suddenly exposed to a large amount of sun that they hadn't been used to, and it does actually cause like a sunburn on the fruit. Here's another disease that's common, actually looks like a disease, probably not a disease. This is blossom end rot. And you can see that it's occurring on the bottom of the fruit, opposite the stem. So that's where the blossom would have been. And it's really a lack of calcium that causes blossom end rot. And this brown spot gets really leathery feeling on the outside, but the rot is occurring on the inside, there on the end. And calcium is usually fairly available in the soil. But if you have a problem with the roots, if you're inconsistent with your watering, the calcium cannot move into the roots without sufficient water. So if you don't water enough, you're not getting enough calcium. If you water too much, you could get root rot, and then the roots cannot take up any nutrients. So the plant is lacking in calcium, and that's probably what causes the blossom end rot. So fixing your water issues can really go a long way to solving blossom end rot. Damping off is a fungal disease that occurs in seedlings, and it's a soil-borne fungus that's particularly prevalent in wet, cool conditions. And so it attacks the real soft tissue right at the soil line. So it causes the stem to die back and the plant falls over and never recovers. Once the plant gets a little older and has a few sets of its regular leaves, it's usually not susceptible to damping off. So if you're growing your own seedlings, or if you have a problem with damping off in your garden, you can grow in a sterile potting mix. That will definitely help. If you raise your transplants up to a larger size before you put them in the garden, then that can help as well. Sterilize your trays and tools with a bleach solution to help control, kill off the spores of the fungus. Mildews are another fungal disease. Powdery mildew and downy mildew are two of our most prevalent. Powdery mildew is especially common in cucurbits like zucchini, squash, cucumber, melons. And it does have that kind of gray powdery look to the leaf. This left picture is squash. The right picture is zucchini. Up at the top, that is a cucumber infected with downy mildew. And downy mildew usually causes yellow spots on the upper side. And if you turn the leaf over, you may see like a gray fuzz under the leaf. Mildews can be controlled using some organic fungicides like oils and sulfur and sometimes copper. So there's also a baking soda product called Millstop, which is works on powdery mildew. Blights are another bacterial or fungal problem. They often cause leaf spots or death of the leaf. The leaves can wilt or drop off completely. It is hard to tell the difference between bacterial and fungal problems. They show very similar signs and symptoms. Bacteria can sometimes look a little more watery or water-soaked spots, but diseases in general are pretty difficult to identify. Even professionals and extension professionals have trouble with diseases, and sometimes you just can't identify it from a photo or a description or just looking at it. You need to send it to a lab for analysis. They need to culture it out to tell exactly what the disease-causing organism is. Here we have on pepper on the left, the wilted pepper, that's southern blight. That's early blight in tomatoes at the bottom. And this was a bean blight. Can't remember exactly what it was on the top right. Viruses are kind of an unusual thing. They're not really an organism. They're actually a very small bit of DNA or RNA that's wrapped in protein, and they don't live independently. Viruses have to have a host in order to reproduce. So they infect the cells of the host and use that for reproduction and to spread to other cells. Really, viruses cannot be cured. It's best to try to prevent them in the first place by using disease-resistant varieties, controlling sap-feeding insects, sterilizing your tools, removing infected plants. That's really, when you know you have a virus that's incurable, it's best just to get the plant out of there. And you can see oftentimes a bright yellow color associated with viruses. This is a cucumber mosaic virus, I believe, in the top, and tomato yellow leaf curl virus there at the bottom, a very common virus of tomato. So how can you try to prevent diseases? Because prevention is key. Most fungicides are not going to cure diseases. They will prevent their spread to the healthier parts of the plant. So if you spray a fungicide as a preventative at the first sign of disease, that can help. Once the disease is rampant, there's really not a lot you can do, and you probably ought to just get rid of the plant. But beforehand, you can think about if every year you have trouble with early blight or verticillium wilt or fusarium wilt. Look for varieties that are resistant to these, and you'll have better success. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're not going to come down with the disease, but these resistant varieties can still produce fruit or produce vegetables for you despite having the disease. So they're resistant. They're not necessarily immune. Whenever you buy seeds or transplants, try to use good sources to make sure that they're disease-free. If you're growing your own seeds, use commercial potting mixes that are sterile. And many diseases are carried by water. So water in the morning so that the leaves will dry during the day. If you water in the evening, the leaves could stay wet for a longer time and provide a favorable environment for disease. Also try to avoid overhead watering, which wets the leaves and creates that environment for disease. Control disease-spreading insects, rotate your plants, move your whole garden if you need to a better spot. Rotate your whole garden if you can, if you're really having a problem. Pick off and dispose of any diseased leaves or leaves that fall to the ground. Clean those up and use fungicides as a preventative. Some organic fungicides include copper, sulfur, and horticultural oils. So just to reiterate, some of the steps for successful IPM include inspection, identification of what you find, treatment, and evaluation. I'll leave it at this slide. These are some of the resources that we have through the University of Florida IFAS Extension. IFAS stands for the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. So Extension falls under that. And there are a lot of good resources completely free available on the internet. Oops. How did that happen? No. I wanted to leave it on that slide. Whoops. But I will go ahead and stop sharing and take any questions that you have for me now. How did I do on time? I went a little over. Let me see. Questions. Can you mention treatments for each type of pest, please? Well, I did kind of go over that, but I will say that there is a very good publication by the University of Florida called the Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide. And in that guide, you will find a table with different pesticides or different pests and which pesticides work best for those. So I will try to put that, well, it's called the Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide. If you Google that, you'll find it. Can you save a plant that's been infected by whiteflies if they make it to the adult stage? Yes, I would say so. When you notice the adults, you will probably also find nymphs under the leaves. So go ahead and treat for the whitefly nymphs, and eventually you'll get the problem under control. I have a lot of aphids on my milkweed, but never see ladybugs. Is there anything I can do to attract ladybugs? I have a diversity of insects and flowers. There are certain plants that ladybugs do prefer. I'm trying to think. I think alyssum was one of them that was highly preferred by ladybugs. But I would say keep a close eye on your milkweeds, because the aphids tend to go through cycles. They'll get cleaned up by the beneficial insects, and I often see lacewing larvae on my milkweeds, as well as Syrphid Fly larvae. And you may not really recognize these at first, but once you get an idea of the identification, you will probably see those on your milkweeds, and you know, the beneficials will clean them up. they'll go away, the aphids will come back, and it's kind of a cycle that occurs on the milkweed. They get cleaned up and then they come back, but the beneficials usually come back to take care of them. The name of the book from IPM is called Helpful, Harmful, Harmless. Maybe not in that order. Helpful, harmless, harmful, something like that. If you go to the IPM bookstore and search for that, you'll find it there. How often should one scout? That is a good question. I recommend getting out and scouting at least once a week, and more often if you can. What is the maximum length of time one can wait? I'm not sure what that means. Ivory soap and water as substitute for store-bought insecticidal spray. Ivory is a soap, but it has not been tested on plants. That's why we usually recommend that you use an insecticidal soap, because it has been formulated with plants in mind. So although there are some plants that can't take soap, and it will tell you on the label which ones those are. So, you know, the label provides a lot of good information. Have you heard about wintergreen oil applied to the plant to attract beneficials? No, I have not. Don't know anything about that. Does alyssum grow well here? Yes, it does in the wintertime. In the cooler weather, definitely not a warm weather plant, but it makes a wonderful filler in container gardens or as edging along the edge of the garden, because it's very low growing and it blooms a lot. Helpful, harmful, harmless. There we go. Thank you, Sally. And with that, I think we're done with the questions. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. I hope you will use some of this information as you get out into your garden and get planting and growing. And don't forget, the session has been recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel, UF IPM Extension Manatee County. Thank you so much.